welcome back to another video. You might have seen name change. Um, After discussing with my siblings, ended up realizing that the name I had, you know, what's it, the critical engineer, was being used by a couple of different variations of the name. Um, but now we're going by the urban engineer, whatever that was the name I thought of. But um, yeah, this is where we're at. This is where we're going with. So this is the excuse me. This is the urban engineer. Um, Welcome to another video. Um, so today's topic, I'm gonna kind of got some notes right here. Um, we're gonna talk about product development. Obviously, this is what I do for a living. Um, so I want to kind of get into the nitty gritty of how do ideas come to life, and this can kind of be transferable between not just engineering, but it can be for STEM fields, whether you're in in other business, or any other career that might have you dealing with some form or variation of product development, right? I'm breaking this down into roughly 7 phases. I might go a little bit off, um, a little bit off of some of what I broke down into phases, just to kind of give you an idea of exactly, um, or a rough idea of exactly the background of what a product development engineer does, um, and what it takes essentially to bring a product from conceptual idea all the way down to an actual physical product. um Whether it's it's actual an actual physical product or something you're doing online or anything of the sort, right? um or any other skills or commodities you might be offering to whatever market you're particularly in right now. So first phase, or I can break down each the 7 phases real quick. I'll just give you a run through of exactly what I have listed. There might be some stuff missing, but if anything, if you guys want to know a bit more, want me to hone in on exactly a particular area, just let me know in the comments. I'll feel free to kind of discuss whatever at this point. um and also just a quick little I guess PSA or whatever whatever the term is. Been a little bit been busy. Second job, kicking my butt. So, um, been quite caught up with that. Making extra money on the side is great. So I'm not complaining, but I'm just tired. So I haven't really had the time to sit down and go ahead and crank out another video. But um, back to the topic. First seven phases, or the first, or the excuse me, 7 phases in general. Um, First phrase I have listed is just going to be, find the gap in the market, or essentially what, since you kind of figure out exactly what your target is, for whatever, idea, whatever you want to pursue. Phase two is going to be the initial idea proposal. So once you kind of come to that conclusion of what you want to do, you know, this is where you kind of get into the nitty gritty of starting to, crank out. Um, Phase three is going to be cost estimate to complete. And this can be fluid um, as you further work on everything. Phase four is going to be concept development, prototyping, design review or product review, or even concept review. Phase five is going to be testing and validation. This is probably more so for those who are actually producing actual, items or products that can be physically used. Phase six, introduction to the market. And phase seven is going to be maintainability. Um, so particularly in what I do, working in firearms development, this is a mix of what I've seen or noticed, and probably what other engineers most likely kind of go through, especially if they're in the research and development kind of aspect of engineering, um, or for those who are in business, you've got a new business model, business plan, um, or if you're a software developer just coming out with just new apps or websites and programs and stuff like that. Now highlighting really on phase one, finding the gap in the market, right? So typically, a lot of companies have their own particular niche areas or areas in the market that they're particularly competing in. A lot of times, this can be something that's based off of what they're currently selling, and you might have some what we call product managers, um, or even the higher ups, say your vice presidents, your directors of operations, and stuff like that. Depending on how further up in the chain you are, you know, you may or may not be the one directly going through the process of analyzing exactly where your gaps are and stuff that you're selling or making or producing, versus what's currently out there in the market. So identify something, particular gap in the market, or whether or not you're just um, kind of advancing or overhauling a current product that you currently have or are selling or whatever. You will tend to either develop or make improvements um, based off of things that you might have learned in the past from different products or other things you might be seeing in that's going around in the market. Um, you're going to kind of sit down, hash it out. This could be involved with other engineers, other executives, or other people who are further up in the food chain. Um, and this is where the initial talks typically happen, at those higher level product meetings essentially. Um, Now going into phase two. Phase two is going to be the initial idea proposal. So based off of what the consensus is, you know, obviously, like I said before, you're going to be hashing out the idea, and then there's going to be some form of a formal proposal that's going to be written. Highlighting, this is what the company or what whoever's in charge, thinks the company should be focusing on, right? What the pros and cons are going to be, um, what hurdles might come from that, and basically kind of essentially laying out the initial groundwork to begin developing or begin to gather whatever information you might need that's going to make this practice successful. Um, Typically, that can be done as a written form, a paper document, or whatever. Sometimes people who are a bit more visual can go ahead and kind of make PowerPoints. I've seen that happen over the course of the different companies I've worked for. And like I said, it could just also just be a straight up Word document, highlighting pros and cons and so forth, everything that the higher ups might need to see to basically give you the green light on, okay, yeah, you can go ahead, or we should pursue this, right? Phase three, this is probably something that's typically kind of, depending on how it's applied, will basically be done across the board. And that's going to be cost estimate to complete the design, right? So sometimes for previous, say Apple, Microsoft, Dell, or whoever, or, for what I do, um, you're going to basically kind of start to initially lay out how much are you willing to spend as far as the initial capital to go ahead and have this product be done, right? It could be you're going to highlight your selling points, or how much you're going to sell it for, um, you know what revenue you're aiming to make off of said product, how much is it going to cost to go ahead and develop, um, how much is it going to cost in pushing it out to the market, and various other costs, um, work hours, materials, stuff like that. could be human resources as a whole, the vendors, stuff like that. So you kind of get an overall brief estimate based off of what could have been done previously for different projects or different products. This will kind of give you, give the company a understanding of what this might, cost us to go ahead and do. Um, Now, if it's something brand new, you might pull different bits and pieces of information, or you might go into a little bit of consulting with, with, outside people or people inside the company, just to get an understanding of, are you covering everything? Now, this can be subject to change. Um, Sometimes everything might not go to plan. So you might leave some wiggle room for, okay, we can go above, or we have this much space to go above the actual targeted costs, or we can go ahead and if we end up it comes out to be cheaper, that's always a plus. Companies are not going to say no to saving some money, right? You know, Basically max profits for the lowest amount of initial investment, right? Um, Going into phase 4, this is where we start to get really into the real meat of the project, right? So this is going to be the concept development. Concept development, can be a typical timeline. Oh, sorry, just thought about this. Kind of going into the cost estimate, they might be schedules that might be already in place for certain products, that says you have X amount of time to go ahead and complete this. And that can also be a bit fluid depending on if development and everything takes a bit longer, or there's some hiccups. You never know. It could be with vendors, could be with things that are going on within, internally with the company, um, or whatever else, whatever the case might be. It could be economics and stuff like that being involved. That's kind of pushing things behind. Um, but when it comes to concept development, if you're in the engineering world, or STEM world and stuff like that, this can kind of vary. If you're doing a lot of research, you might just have time to go ahead and just kind of experiment with certain stuff, see what works, see what doesn't work, um, and then you start to kind of really get a proper grasp on exactly um, what it's going to take to actually get this done. As far as from the technical standpoint, people on the higher ups don't always completely understand um, exactly what the hiccups are, what it takes to really do stuff. That really goes for anyone. Um, so when you start to get through this development phases, and really get into the development cycle, this is where you start to lay out all your initial ideas, parts, materials, um, um, get the initial layouts kind of situated, or start to really get your foundation of the product underway as far as on the full-on hands-on technical aspect. And for a lot of engineers, or even for other STEM folks, um, this is where, like I said, this is where you really start to understand exactly, okay, hey, I'm running into this issue, or we can't do it this way, so we need to figure out another way. Once you start getting through, or start diving right into the concept phase, this is where it's reality can hit. Or if you're just a genius, everything just works out perfectly fine for you. Typically they don't. um this is where you start to um get a better understanding of exactly what you're tasked with doing. And this can have deadlines, a year development, 6 months development, 5 years development, depending on how long. um it really just up to exactly what the resources and what they're willing to spend out, or exactly how urgent of a project that this might be, right? um and kind of you know going from prototyping phase, as far as the initial concepts, you also will, um for some folks, you're going to have your design review, or your initial concept review. For engineering wise, you can be meeting with senior engineers, engineering managers, director of engineering, or whoever else might need to be privy to exactly what's going on. Sometimes Sometimes, some of the higher ups, marketing executives and stuff like that might not get too involved until a little bit later. But you might have, like your engineer managers or directors are the ones who are kind of keeping track, and they relay the information over to, they relay the information over to the higher ups. Because sometimes some higher ups don't necessarily care what's going on in between, but they just want to make sure that the product is getting done right. Because obviously, if you're higher ups, your executives, you got a lot more things to focus on. So as long as they know the project is going smoothly, or they're well informed, or at least kept up to date about exactly what's going on, they won't really they won't really bug too much, right? So these design reviews can be a mix between other engineers or other product developers. And this is where you start to basically come under scrutiny, especially depending on if you're doing a lot of products on your own, like typically what happens where I work. Or if you're at a larger company, you might go ahead and have what is it? You might have a larger team. You might be working in like a team of anywhere between two to say tens of engineers or other developers. But obviously, in those larger companies, you're typically not working on one entire project solely as your on your own, as your own responsibility, right? I know in larger companies like Pratt and Whitney, or a lot of the aerospace companies, there's a lot of engineers working on one particular aspect, and all the way up into full systems, systems design to you got your hot and cold sections on your engines, you got your structural team, and it could be tasked with designing and overseeing various just different aspects. I've never heard of any larger engineering firm or company who has one person dealing with one entire project, unless they're like project engineers or project managers, where they oversee everything. But as far as the ones who like the technical guys, the engineers, um, they're always typically going to be tasked with one particular area. Now, specialty or not, that depends on what the company you work for, but typically you're going to be working in groups unless you're at a smaller company, um, where you might just be the only one working on it, and then you have your supervisor, whatever. So your idea is going to come under scrutiny from said group of people. They're going to really start trying to pull this whatever your idea apart, to kind of see if there is any gaps that you should be concerned about, any oversights you might have made, anything you might have underestimated or might have taken into consideration. They're going to be the ones to give you that feedback. Sometimes this can be a once a week kind of thing, or twice a week, um, but sometimes it can get pretty tough. Especially for the more experienced engineers who've seen things already and have dealt with certain things. They're gonna ask you questions with the intention of getting you to think, because they already dealt with it, right? This is going to be for any type of career path that you've taken that involves you cranking out, that you're cranking out a project. Your stuff might end up coming under scrutiny, and has to go through multiple meetings of, hey, have you thought about this? Hey, did you consider this? And then that's where we start to then absorb and kind of adapt, based off of the feedback you already got. All right. Going into phase five, is going to be testing and validation. So depending on products, cars, firearms, defense industries, whatever, plumbing, HVAC, um, testing phase and testing and validation can go ahead and be the part where you really put your design or concept through the paces, right? And that can really be the make it or break it, where you're like, okay, I got to redo everything that I just did over the past, X amount of time, right? And sometimes you learn some things. Sometimes you just kind of, feel like I did all this and just now it's breaking. But then, that's where you learn, you adapt, and you improve, right? So for some products, depending on what you're doing, what you're making, um, you're gonna have you're gonna have your different I'm gonna say lifing, right? The life cycle of the product. What are you expecting? to get out of the whatever you're going to get out of the project or the product, excuse me. Whether it's going to be X amount of years, X amount of cycles, X amount of repetitions on a particular part. This is where you come up with your test plan. If requires, um, set the benchmark for what you're expecting this to do, what how long you expect it to last, or even how much just overall just how much abuse is going to be able to take. This can vary from product to product. If you have things that are in the same particular product line, you might want them to kind of be roughly in the same ballpark. I know for firearms it's a bit different depending on calibers and so forth um, of the firearm. Because obviously not every firearm is rated to be able to run through the same amount of ammunitions or rounds every time. Um, but for cars, you always gonna have your products that's gonna have some type of life into it. Every automakers have this part will last you X amount of miles until it should be replaced or until it needs to be replaced. Um, so this is where you go ahead and really put your design through its paces. Whatever kind of environmental testing or it's kind of real world scenarios, kind of ordeals, depending on what you're doing, and just put it through its paces. Um, I guess going through phase six. Once you have gone ahead and went through the entire from idea to concept to okay, I have the first physical products, and you have validated exactly everything, whether or not the cost is there or whatever. Um, you should I don't know what he's growling at, but um, this is where you start to get prepping to introduce to the market, right? How are you going to market the product? Who are you trying to grab the attention of? Um, who are going to be the consumers and so forth? And that's things you typically take into consideration when you're going through the initial idea proposal, when you're kind of understanding the looking for the gap in the market. Um, when you're going through to the introduction to the market, you're going through a launch phase, which can be quite hectic. Everyone's kind of going through their paces and following up with the product, looking at how well people take it, and that can be a make it or break it too. You might think some people want one thing, and then you end up finding out that it's another, or with whoever's receiving your product, they might put something through its paces that you haven't even thought about doing, and that's something you can learn and adapt and put it into the next product. So those kind of ordeals, that kind of phase is going to really be quite hectic. Obviously, outside of the actual development work and all that stuff, that can be a pain too. But once it launches, you kind of get that sigh of relief, like, hey, I don't need to deal with this anymore. But in reality, a lot of times your products, you're always going to be dealing with it. There's rarely a case, or it probably is not as frequent, where you're going to be done with the product and you're never going to look at it again. A lot of times, especially with the with the industry I work in, that product is going to be in your space for a while. Um, you know, it's going to be in your space until they end up deciding to discontinue or come out with a new version, right? And this is where um, maintain phase seven, which is going to be maintainability, right? Um, Kind of upkeep of the product, whether or not it's like, okay, hey, we are adding in a new part, um, kind of seeing what the customer feedback is, and you're kind of slowly rolling that into you're rolling that into the next release or a forward change or updates, or even if say if customers or consumers have the opportunity to send parts back, and you're able to go ahead and update parts, swap out parts for them. I know with my last company, we would take the feedback directly from the airports or the airlines that would be buying our products, and we would make the changes, within reason that makes sense. We would go ahead and take their concerns and implement that into their next order, or they might send somebody out to go ahead and do some fixes. There was technicians and stuff like that located all across the country, where they ship them out, fly them out, and see if they can do anything, and then relay that information back to us, and then basically we go ahead and make the improvements to the product for as long as we are currently selling. And obviously, in the background, they're probably already talking about what's going to be the next product that comes out. And typically, you might have companies who will have like product lines or things that they already have a schedule for that they want to develop. And that's slowly what you're going to be. They already have the whole thing figured out, and that's what you're going to be working on for the next one. A lot of times some companies, or for instance like Apple, they just launched, they'll launch one phone, and then they're already working on developing the next, which I don't know, I forgot how long, how frequently they come out, but as soon as they got the one, there's already another one being developed, and then that one is basically kind of gives them that cushion versus having to um basically wait until it's like, okay, this is when basically waiting until the last minute to start developing something new. You're gonna go ahead and experience a lot of different things dealing with product development, excuse me, um, or whatever career path that involves you pushing out products and selling a commodity, um, to the general masses, right? So, I think from this, this is the for the most part, I think I covered exactly what all the different phases I can think of. There's some stuff that blends in together, that might kind of fuse and kind of always be consistently being adjusted or changed. Product plans, um, the scheduling plan, the layouts, timelines, and all that stuff can be fluid, can change, um, depending on exactly what's going on. Um, so everything as far as product development, in just a brief, little sloppy, video essentially, is going to be this is exactly um, how most companies or some companies might operate, not exactly to the T. There could be a lot more technical details and also just reports written and stuff like that, um, to go along with whatever market these companies are in. So I believe that is it. Um, like I said again, sorry for having been around. I've been working, pick second job, so trying to keep this going. Um, hopefully grow the channel. At this point, don't necessarily care too much. Like obviously it'd be great, but this is just something to keep my sanity. Um, but give me something to do on the side and really start to learn. I plan to get a camera at some point. God willing. Um, I plan to get something. Get a camera so I can actually do a proper setup. Get a new computer and all this stuff, because obviously recording off my phone, so quality is okay. But let me know in the comments if you have any other questions. You can dig a little bit. Kind of briefly, just kind of sped through all the things I can think of in like 5 minutes that would possibly be useful for those who are in the realm of product development. And these skills can be, transferable and adapted to a multitude of different markets. So feel free, comment below, like the video, share the video, do whatever. Don't really matter. Just give me some feedback. Um, and until the next time, deuces.